Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome to The World Over Live. We've got a stellar show for you tonight. My exclusive interview with Republican candidate for president Mitt Romney is straight ahead. And it's already been covered by outlets from the AP to the New York Times. I sat down with Governor Romney earlier this week, and he spoke candidly about his faith, how it has prepared him for the highest office in the land, his relationship with his running mate, and much more. He'll also break some news straight ahead. And later, radio talk show host and author Laura Ingraham is here to give us her take on the interview and discuss a few of the hot-button issues surrounding the campaign. Finally, I'll bring you an encore of an interview I did with the founder of the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, Seamus Hasson, about his book, The Right to Be Wrong, Ending the Culture War Over Religion in America. It is newly updated and just came out in paperback. Remember that you can be part of the program, so get your calls and emails in now. The number, 1-800-221-9460 in the U.S., and internationally, 205-271-2980, or drop us an email, worldover@EWTN.com. Let's get started. Here's the brief. News from the world over this week. As food shortages and the humanitarian crisis continue to grow in Syria, 12,000 Catholics in one village are facing starvation and disease, a situation being made worse by a rebel blockade. According to Fides News, the people of Rable, near Homs, have been subject to a strict 2-week-long blockade by armed opposition groups of the Assad regime. The town is literally surrounded on all sides and cannot receive food or medicine. A local church source has reported that snipers have killed 3 young men in the village, including a married father of 4. Melkite Catholic Patriarch Gregory III Leum has issued an urgent call for food and aid in the region. Meanwhile, next month's papal visit to Lebanon will go ahead as planned, despite fighting spilling over from Syria and a recently foiled plot to assassinate Lebanon's top Catholic prelate. A Lebanese court recently indicted a former cabinet minister and 2 Syrian military officers for an alleged bomb plot to kill the Maronite Patriarch Cardinal Boutros Rai. The attack was to take place during Cardinal Rai's visit last week to a Sunni region of northern Lebanon, just miles from the Syrian border. One of the indicted men implicated President al-Assad, saying, "This is what Assad wants," end quote. The killing of a top Christian official could destabilize the Lebanese government, according to analysts. Meanwhile, sectarian violence has broken out in northern Lebanon. Sunnis there have clashed with Muslims loyal to al-Assad. In spite of it all, Pope Benedict's Lebanon visit was confirmed this week by the Vatican. The Pope will not be visiting northern Lebanon. And the Chinese government has ordered 2 Shanghai seminaries to shut down. This is the apparent retaliation to a bishop's very public resignation from the communist-run Catholic Patriotic Association. In July, Shanghai Auxiliary Bishop Ma Tadeo Dakin announced his resignation during his ordination mass. Meanwhile, he remains under house arrest, forbidden from public appearances and from wearing his episcopal insignia. A Shanghai bishop says the 2 seminaries will not open for classes in September as scheduled and will remain closed until further notice. He offered no explanation other than citing the present situation. The seminary shutdown will reach well beyond the Diocese of Shanghai, as the seminary is a feeder for 5 other dioceses. And 2 more bishops came to the defense of Catholic GOP vice presidential candidate Paul Ryan this week. Since being picked for the VP slot, some Catholics have recycled criticism that Ryan's budget proposals to reduce the federal debt are immoral, claiming that his suggested cuts would hurt the poor. Cardinal Timothy Dolan of New York said on his weekly radio show that he knew Ryan and his family well during his time as Archbishop of Milwaukee. Ryan is a great public servant, Dolan said, adding that he has immense regard and admiration and affection for him. And Denver Archbishop Samuel Aquila spoke more directly to the Ryan budget, saying claims that Ryan's fiscal policies are anti-Catholic are unfounded and unreasonable. Archbishop Aquila explained that to protect future generations from even greater amounts of debt, voters and politicians should discuss fiscal policy with a Christian sense of responsibility. That includes spending and the limitation of resources. He added that a more constructive discussion on the issue is needed. A U.S. district judge in Oregon this week dismissed a sex abuse lawsuit against the Holy See, ruling that the Vatican was not an employer of an accused ex-priest, Andrew Ronan, and therefore cannot be held financially liable for the abuse. Judge Michael Mossman said the plaintiff's argument that the Vatican has absolute control over all priests could mean that all Catholics could be considered Vatican employees. He instead compared the Vatican's control over priests to that of a bar association over lawyers. U.S. counsel for the Holy See, Jeffrey Lena, said the ruling is particularly important since documents related to the case found no evidence that the Holy See was an employer of Ronan. And this past week, Cardinal Francis George of Chicago disclosed that he has been diagnosed with cancer in his kidney and liver. This is the Cardinal's second bout with cancer. In 2006, he underwent major surgery for bladder cancer and was subsequently pronounced cancer-free after his course of treatment. Cardinal George, who's led the faithful of Chicago since 1997, turned 75 in January. He submitted his required resignation to Pope Benedict, but there's been no indication from Rome that the Pope intends to accept that resignation anytime soon. Cardinal George's medical prognosis is not yet clear. He's likely to undergo further testing, followed by treatment. Our prayers go out to Cardinal George for his complete recovery. And finally, on a lighter note, the small Spanish town of Broja is facing or trying to figure out what to do with a 19th century painting of Christ that's been disfigured by a local artist who took it upon herself to restore it. 80-year-old Celia Jimenez decided to touch up a fresco reproduction entitled "Behold the Man" at the local parish because she thought it needed restoration. Here was her final product. Apparently, no one realized how badly disfigured the painting was until she rang the town hall to announce what she had done. Jimenez claimed this was not the first time she has restored a painting. Church officials are hoping the damage to the fresco is not irreversible. Behold, poor Mrs. Jimenez. Sometimes it pays to bring in the professionals. When we return, my exclusive interview with Republican presidential candidate and presumptive nominee Mitt Romney. The World Over Live. It continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
This first interview is already making headlines all over the world. My first guest is the former governor of Massachusetts and the soon-to-be nominated Republican candidate for president. I sat down with him recently in New Orleans to discuss some of the major issues of this campaign, including religious liberty and charges that he's attempting to lower his personal tax rate. He also spoke very openly about prayer, his Mormon faith, and how it has prepared him for the office of president. Here's my exclusive interview with Governor Mitt Romney. Governor, in 2008, you were awarded the Canterbury Medal by the foremost group in the country defending religious liberty, the Becket Fund. And at that dinner in New York, you said, freedom requires religion and religion requires freedom. Explain that to people.
Well, I think most people can understand the second part of that sentence, that religion requires freedom, because if there's not freedom to worship, of course, religion has a hard time breaking through to the hearts of people that aren't already religious. And so nations that have crushed religion, have crushed freedoms, are in often cases devoid of the kind of religious experience that our people deserve. But the other side of that expression, which is that freedom requires religion, that I hope people understand as you look at the history of this country. The freedom that was unleashed upon the world came as a result of individuals who recognized that our rights came from our Creator, not from government. And that observation led to a bursting forth on the world scene of freedom. Freedom for people not only to choose who would represent them in government, but freedom to live their lives as they wish, freedom to pursue happiness as they wish. So, and in one more sense I'll just note, and that is that I believe in democracies and free nations, that people have to have a sense of right and wrong, a purpose greater than self, in order for the society to work. I think de Tocqueville, in looking at America, recognized that in America there was a sense of right and wrong. And these things, I believe, are an essential part of free nations working effectively and having a productive and prosperous future.
The Catholic community in this country and people across the faith spectrum were outraged by President Obama's HHS mandate requiring abortifacients and contraceptives to be available to employees. It set off protests by the Catholic bishops and individual people of faith. What will you do as president about that HHS mandate?
Well, first of all, I'll continue to meet with Cardinal Dolan, who, by the way, is going to offer the benediction on the last evening of the Republican convention after my acceptance speech. So I'm making it very clear that the interest of religious freedom is something I support wholeheartedly. And we'll work with him and with others to assure that each piece of legislation we consider is thought also in terms of its impact on religious freedom and tolerance. This is a nation where our first freedom is the right to worship God as we choose. And any effort on the part of the federal government to intrude on religious liberty and to reject tolerance in favor of government mandate is a violation of that first freedom.
Should a religious liberty plank be inserted in the GOP platform?
You know, I haven't looked at the GOP platform, so I don't know what's there or what's not there, but I can tell you it is certainly part of my plank, if you will, for the platform that I run on, which is that I and Paul Ryan are committed to assuring that religions of whatever background should have the right to choose to worship God in the way they prefer, and that religions should not have imposed on them the dictates of a government.
I want to talk about you and your personal faith for a moment. A friend of yours, Ann Madsen, was quoted. She's a Bible scholar friend. She said, "Prayer is not a rote thing for Mitt Romney." When do you pray? And has prayer changed a decision you were making or affected your personal life in any way that you can recall?
Well, I believe that Providence has helped guide me in decisions I made throughout my life. I pray every day, typically more than once. When I pray, I pray for guidance. It is not necessarily just a recitation of the concerns of each day, but rather asking for help and guidance and inspiration. And there have been important decisions. Perhaps the most important decisions a father faces relates to the children and how to help them in difficult times. I remember one son had a particularly challenging adolescence, and we were finding ourselves drifting further and further away from him. And our natural response was to criticize him, to correct him, to tell him what mistakes he was making. And after giving it a good deal of prayer and thought, the thought came to me to, instead of criticizing him, tell him how much we love him, how much we appreciate him, how much his life means to our lives. And that, as the poet said, made all the difference.
Do you feel God is calling you to this position, to be President of the United States?
You know, I don't believe that God gets heavily involved in politics. So I believe that God's work is to save souls and bring them to return to Him. At the same time, I believe that the interests of saving souls is associated as well with freedom. That freedom allows religion to bloom and grow, and that people draw closer to God by drawing closer to their respective faiths. So I don't pretend to have a religious mandate. I do, however, believe that a mandate of protecting freedom has a very significant beneficial impact on the ability of individuals to draw closer to divinity.
Let's shift gears for a moment. I want to talk about Paul Ryan, your running mate. Watching you all on the trail, and I've seen you in person once and now on television a number of times together, you seem rejuvenated. You seem more on point. Why not campaign more together? I know that defies the conventional wisdom. Is that going to be a pattern in these last 2 months of the campaign?
Well, we will surely have events that take us together and allow us to campaign to groups of people, and they get to see how we work together. And by the way, I agree with you. Yeah. I like working with Paul. We have different life experiences. We can each draw on those experiences to do a better job. At the same time, we have to do something that the president has really caused us to do, which is to have to raise an inordinate amount of money. This is the first post-Watergate president who doesn't have federal spending limits. He's brushed them aside. So to be competitive, we got to raise a lot of money, and that means Paul has to go one way, I go another, to get the funds necessary to keep up on the air.
This weekend, the president accused you of choosing Paul Ryan to lower your own tax rate. He said, well, this is so Mitt Romney can lower his rate to an effective 1% rate. Your reaction?
It's a little silly. Obviously, I pay a very substantial amount of money in taxes, also give substantially to charity, and well more than 20%, well more, goes to charity and taxes. And I'm not in this race, and I haven't contributed the money in my campaigns and the time in my campaigns to try and lower my tax bill. What I'm concerned about is helping people who don't have work be able to have a good job. I want folks to know that when they retire, their retirement is secure. I want moms and dads to know that their child is going to get an education that will lead to a good job. And I want people to know that if they get ill, they'll get health care that's good and affordable. Those are the reasons that I'm running for president. And sometimes what Peter says about Paul tells you more about Peter than Paul. So I don't know what the president's taxes are doing these days.
I want to talk about Paul Ryan, as I noticed he hasn't worn a tie since you made him your running mate. Is this a rule in the Romney camp? No ties for Ryan?
You know, Paul dresses the way he wants to dress. I give him no guidance whatsoever. But in our rallies, we're typically outdoors on a very hot and sunny day. And who the heck's going to wear a tie and a jacket on a hot day? Just guys like you. That's right, the commentators.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Let's talk about your opponents. Rudy Giuliani suggested that Vice President Biden may lack the mental, and I want to quote this correctly, the mental balance for the job. Do you agree with that appraisal?
You know, I don't focus on the personal characteristics of the president or the vice president. I instead run my campaign focused on their policy choices. And the policy choices they have made have quite clearly failed the American people. We have 23 million Americans out of work today. 1 out of 6 Americans has fallen into poverty. More than ever in our history are now poor in America. The gap between wealthy and poor has grown larger than any time in history. The president's policies have failed, and I step away from the discussions about his personality or character and that of the vice president. I know that's what they tend to do, but you know, this is a time to talk about getting America back on track, not a time to vilify fellow Americans.
They continue to pound you, and the president this week again brought up Medicare, he brought up taxes. If this economy turns around, what argument will you make to the American people? If the economy is off the table and it seems to rebound suddenly?
The economy continues to be the #1 issue for the American people, and whether there's a bump in the road that makes things a little better or whether there's a down bump, people know over the last 3.5, 4 years, things have not been the way they should have been in this country. That's #1. And #2, looking at a program like Medicare, this is the health care program for seniors in America. People recognize that the president's plan to cut Medicare by $716 billion is going to hurt current retirees. And I think people understanding that, you're going to find, are going to say, you know what, we need to have a different direction in Washington and not the kind of robbing of Medicare to pay for Obamacare that this president is putting in place.
Talk to me for a moment about the Latino vote. This is, the Catholic bishops have spent an inordinate amount of time concerned about immigration and caring for immigrants, whether they're documented or undocumented. The president recently signed this executive order delaying deportations for 1.7 million young Latinos. Will you repeal that executive order or leave it in place?
You know, the president actually proposed or said during his campaign that he would put in place legislation that dealt with all immigration issues, in particular illegal immigration and those that have come here illegally, either by themselves or with their children. And yet, after 3.5 years, he just didn't do that. If I become president, I will put in place permanent legislation. I will establish not just a temporary pathway, but a clear understanding of what the course will be for those that have come here through no fault of their own, to their parents, for their parents, and for others that want to come here legally. And I've laid out the plans for my immigration proposals. These will be not a temporary fix, but a permanent fix that will clarify what the future is for people who've come into this country.
I want to return to your faith for a moment. As a bishop in your church, you helped immigrants who were new to the country. You helped couples make ends meet and balance their budgets. You helped unemployed people find work. How did that position as a leader in your church prepare you for this job you seek?
Well, there's no question but that being a pastor, if you will, and a small p pastor, where you're working with people of all different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different economic circumstances, some employed, some unemployed, as you work with those people and try and provide for them a positive path forward in their lives, you understand the very real concerns and pains that people have, the struggles that they have. You want to help them, and that's one of the things that draws me into this race. I want to help the hundreds of millions of Americans who want to see a brighter and more prosperous future, and I think I know how to do that. And I've laid out the plans that would get America doing what it needs to do to give people good jobs and more take-home pay again.
What is the worst part of this for you personally? This has got to be difficult. Running around the country, today you were in 2 different states, 3 different states, event after event after event. What is the worst part of that experience?
Well, the best part is the privilege of running for the presidency of the United States.
I didn't ask you the best part.
And meeting all the people of the country. The worst part, I guess just a different hotel every night. I probably sleep in almost never in the same place twice. And so you get used to different beds, different pillows, different blankets, different air conditioners, different fans. And sometimes your sleep is not as comfortable as you might like it to be. But the best part, of course, is the people, the energy you get from them.
Tell me, what are your hopes as you go forward at this moment? What do you need to accomplish at the Republican National Convention? Where do you think you haven't connected yet with the American people or with a block of voters?
Well, most people have only seen me in 30-second ads, and most of the ads they've seen have been produced by the president and his campaign and supporters, not by my campaign.
Less than flattering.
So they have a less than flattering image of me, and they'll have a little more time to get to know Ann, my wife, maybe my sons, my daughters-in-law, perhaps some grandkids, other people who've known me over my life, and they'll have a fuller picture. They'll either like me more or like me less, but they'll know who I am, I think, in a way that will be helpful to their decision.
Before I let you go, you said at that dinner I mentioned in 2008, I'm not an enormously religious person. Ann taught me the power of faith. How so?
Did I say that exactly? That's an unusual thing coming from me, because I am a very religious person. But Ann is also a religious person with a great deal of faith and confidence in the future, and confidence that that things will work to our eternal benefit if we abide by the covenants we have with God, with each other, if we do our best to live a good life. We've made mistakes. Heaven knows I've made mistakes. Things I've confessed before God and repented of. But nonetheless, we try and get better. I was once told that the difference between a sinner and a saint is not where they are on the ladder toward heaven, but instead what direction they're headed. And I'm trying to head towards the north.
A special thanks to Joe and Sue Ellen Canizero for lending us their home for that interview, and to the Romney team who facilitated it. We have outstanding interview requests to both President Obama and Vice President Biden as well. We hope to hear from them shortly. When we return, radio talk show host and Fox News contributor Laura Ingraham is here to give us her take on the Romney interview and much more when The World Over Live continues. Stay with us.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. Now to react to the Romney interview, to put it in perspective, I'm joined on set by the most listened to woman in political talk. She's a Fox News contributor and the New York Times best-selling author of the I Zing. Laura Ingraham, welcome back to the program.
Hey, good to see you, Arroyo.
Great to see you. Listen, what did Mitt Romney accomplish tonight, and why do you think he's talking in such personal terms?
Well, I think a lot of people, believe it or not, even 6 years after Mitt Romney began running for president, still don't really have a good handle on who he is. And I think they've heard a lot of the negative framing, especially in recent months, from Barack Obama and his campaign or some of the super PACs, but they don't really know him. And I think the way he sat down with you, how at ease he seemed in talking about his faith, prayer, his family, religious liberty. That turns him into a guy, I think, that's much more difficult to caricature and stereotype as the unfeeling, unreachable, very stiff, untouchable Mitt Romney. I think it humanized him. I think he, frankly, really needed that interview. And not that the questions were necessarily easy, but he needed to listen and he needed to answer them. I thought it was very powerful, and I think he needed to do that, obviously, given where the Catholic vote went last election.
Well, and in these swing votes, in these swing states, he's down in a lot of these polls, sometimes by 7 points, 3 points in this recent Quinnipiac poll.
Yeah, the new Fox News poll that came out late today showed that Romney was actually up 1 point. It's pretty interesting.
In the national
national
poll.
Survey, and that it was fairly tight in the Quinnipiac. In Florida and in Ohio. But look, he's definitely not where he wants to be in the state of Ohio. There's no doubt about that. Lots of Catholics there. They have to see him as someone they can relate to, aside from politics. He wants to get those likability numbers up, Raymond. And if he conveys to people that he understands their religious liberty concerns, especially on that contraceptive, abortifacient, sterilization mandate, I think he becomes much more likable and much more trustworthy. And I think he assures a lot of people, reassures them about what he'll do to stand up.
What I saw, and what surprised me, his discipline. He's focused. You can tell he's got a hard-working ethic. All of this seems to be the fruit of his faith. But the discipline and the, I guess, sense of purpose throughout this interview sort of shocked me a little bit. I didn't expect that.
But right and wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, whether you're Democrat or Republican, we all like to believe we have an innate sense of what's right and what's just plain wrong. And I think a lot of people watching what's happening to the country today, they might like Barack Obama and think he has a great family and fun kids and his wife does a lot of good stuff, but they don't like where the country is. And they both have to like Mitt Romney's solutions, and they have to not be offended by Mitt Romney, the man. And I think in what he said to you and how he came across and the ease with which he spoke about these very personal matters and these policy matters, I think that was a different side of him. And, I haven't seen that side of him before, and I was really heartened by it.
Well, with Catholic voters, people always ask, what are the Catholic voters looking for? They look at everything. They're looking for signals. They're looking for signs, not only what people are saying. I think the demeanor here may have made a better impression and a deeper impression on the Catholic vote than anything that was particularly said. Though what he said obviously was important.
Even his faith speech last election cycle, which was a very powerful speech.
In 2008.
But remember, he wasn't the nominee. He got beaten by John McCain, so that kind of faded away. And there's an attempt now in some of the networks to examine the Mormon faith.
Well, is there danger? Is there a danger for Mitt Romney talking about his faith and opening the door? Does that do him more harm than good?
Well, that's what the networks will say. They'll say, well, he's the one who brought it up, or he's the one who he seemed comfortable talking about it with Raymond Arroyo, so why didn't he come on NBC and discuss it during our NBC special on Mormonism? Look, I think people are smart enough to see what's going on here. With a wink and a nod, a lot of these so-called mainstream media outlets are trying to raise questions about whether he will answer to the head of the Mormon Church versus answer to the U.S. Constitution. I think he allayed those fears.
I'm going to play a little example of that. This is from CNN. This is a CNN report, Gary Tuchman reporting, and it is examining Mormonism and Mitt Romney's particularly. Listen.
The suspicion that as president, Romney might take orders from the church derives from Mormon history. Church presidents are considered prophets. In 1843, a prophet's divine revelation led to polygamy. It was then abolished in 1890. So what if today's church president had a major revelation? Could that influence a Romney White House?
This smacks of the same, smacks of the same sort of thing one heard about JFK when he was running as the first Catholic.
Catholics should really be uncomfortable with this.
The Pope is going to control him, and will he take orders from the Vatican?
Some say Mitt Romney will answer to to Salt Lake City and not to the framers' vision of the country. I mean, look, I think we know what's going on here, and I will remind everyone watching EWTN that 4 years ago there were a lot of people out there saying, you can't bring up Reverend Jeremiah Wright. You can't talk about that. You shouldn't profile the Trinity United Church. That's off limits. That's unseemly. Well, actually, Reverend Wright was talking about America's role in the world and giving deeply anti-American statements and comments. And President Obama sat in those pews for 20 years. It was a legitimate question to ask, well, do you agree with what he said? This is going much further in the examination of the Mormon church and just the tone of it. And look, they try to give a wink to being fair in some of these reports. Say, look, they do a lot of good things. Mitt Romney has done wonderful things, incredible charitable work, mentoring and so forth. But, you have to raise the question, at least, the timing right before the Republican convention. And that's why I think it's so smart of the Romney campaign to open up and to start really talking frankly about how his faith informs him in his daily life and the way he approaches problems. And I think you saw that in his interview tonight.
To set their own narrative rather than allowing someone else to do it.
Big get, Raymond.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what do you make of
Huge.
Cardinal Dolan closing out the Republican National Convention? Now, Laura, some are saying this smacks of partisanship, and that the cardinal shouldn't be there. He's somehow giving the weight of the church, bringing the weight of the church to bear on a partisan event. You'd say what?
Well, didn't Cardinal Mahoney in Los Angeles do a lot of work on immigration with Democrats?
Well, Cardinal Mahoney prayed at the Democratic Convention in 2000.
Yeah, it prayed at the Democratic Convention, but in general, it seems to me that church officials have worked with both parties on big issues. And I think, especially given the brutal attacks on religious liberty that go right to the heart of the Catholic Church, I think it is incumbent upon a leader in the Catholic Church to give the benediction at the Republican convention. And look, if the Democrats want Cardinal Dolan to speak at the Democrat convention or to give the benediction, I'm sure he'd say yes. And we pray
he's
for him.
made that offer. He's made that offer.
So it's equal time. If they don't want him, then that's their choice.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. We've been hearing much about the war on women. It's been renewed with this...
the war on women in the womb? Or the war on...
No, not that war on women. The war on women voters. And they're claiming that there's a senatorial candidate, Aiken, in Missouri, and he made some statements about rape vis-a-vis abortion and exemptions. This is being claimed as another example of the war on women. Does this wash, and will women voters pay attention?
I think that momentarily, some of the more activists, pro-abortion forces will say, aha, see, this is what they all feel like. But again, when you think about the problems facing America, and the top 10 issues that people rate are the most critical challenges to the country, the right to abort more of our offspring doesn't rate in the top 10, doesn't rate in the top 25. I think this is the Democrat Party, once again, going down a rabbit hole. And as far as I can tell, the Democrat Party the crux of the party today comes down to three things: raising taxes, the right to more abortions, probably federally funded if they could get their way, and same-sex marriage. That's really it. That's the glue, and that's fine. That's what they believe. But I think the country's broader than that, and I think they're going down I think it's a dangerous path for them. I think people know it's one comment from one senatorial candidate. Mitt Romney's already said he disavows it, and it's not what he believes. And, demonize Paul Ryan. He's not a guy that's easily stereotyped, I think, and demonized. He just doesn't seem threatening to people. And I think what's threatening is what's about to happen to this country if we go off this fiscal cliff on January 1st. That's what's threatening to every single American watching.
There was a report I saw that single women and the soccer moms, their focus seems to be, and they say it in interviews, it's showing up in polling data, the economy. So should Mitt Romney just stay on that message going forward?
Yeah, I think he should both be comfortable with whatever his view is on the life question. I think he should be comfortable. He said, look, this is my view. But let me tell you what I'm running for. I'm not running to be moralizer-in-chief. I'm running to be the chief executive of an ailing country, and I'm going to turn this thing around. This is a big task. I'm going to assemble the best people, but with my expertise and everything I've learned in the business world, I'm the guy who can do it. I'm not going to talk about doing it. I'm not going to campaign perpetually about doing it. I'm going to do it. If he does that, I think women find that reassuring. And I think more women will look at Mitt Romney and say, maybe he's kind of moderate. He might not be as conservative as some of these Tea Party people like. But I like what he's saying, and I liked his approach.
And you notice in the interview, even when he was talking about faith, when he was talking about his faith in the Mormon church, and when he was a bishop, it all got back to, and I'm trying to fix this economy for our families and for our future. I mean, he's really always going back to that point.
The path to American renewal, and the path to American renewal does not rest upon our increasing the number of Americans who are slaughtered in the womb. I'm sorry, but the idea that women are sitting around going, gosh, I wish we had more abortions in the United States, I don't believe that. I just don't believe that that's what's going to drive women at the polls. And I know the Democrats are, throwing the final pass at the buzzer here. I don't think that's the way to win.
What needs to happen at the Republican National Convention next week in Tampa?
I think, again, the sense of reassurance that things are dark right now, but they are going to get better. People are desperate for real hope this time. And we saw hope on a poster, and it was kind of cool and iconic. But now I think a lot of people really believe that America's best days are behind her. China's about to take the baton that we're not willingly wanting to give them, and they're going to run with it. If we don't step up and say, you know, we have now got to fix this mess once and for all. We can't pass it off to our children and grandchildren. They need to see why it's so bad. They need to understand who we owe and how much we owe. And then they need to hear the solutions. This is what I'm going to do. 3 things first, and this is how I'm going to get us on a path to American rebirth. And I think you're going to see that. You're going to see people having a lot of fun. They're not going to be scary. It's not going to be they're going to take us into the dark ages. I think they're going to blow that out of the water. I really do. I think it's going to be a great convention if it's not blown out of the water by a weather event.
Yeah, by Hurricane
they better hope
Isaac.
Yes, we have a Category 5 approaching our economy. We don't need one approaching the RNC.
Okay, we'll leave it there.
Yes,
Laura Ingraham,
great to
thanks
see
for
you.
being here.
Absolutely.
You can hear Laura on the radio every Monday through Friday and find her at lauraingraham.com. Her hilarious book, Of Thee I Zing, is still in bookstores everywhere. We'll be back in a moment. The World Over Live continues. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Nearly every day in school districts, public areas, and workplaces, there is a Cold War being waged over religious freedom. My next guest has been dealing with the question of religious liberty and fighting for it for nearly 20 years. He's the founder of the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. A few years ago, he wrote a book, The Right to Be Wrong, Ending the Culture War Over Religion in America. In it, he discussed what constitutes religious freedom and much more. Now, The Right to Be Wrong has been updated to include Seamus Hasson's thoughts on the current religious liberty skirmishes, and it's now available in paperback. He's been tirelessly fighting for religious freedom despite his own struggle with Parkinson's disease. Here's an encore of my interview with Kevin Seamus Hasson, founder of the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. Take a look. In the book, you describe the 2 camps, if you will, on the opposite sides of this religious liberty cultural war as pilgrims and park rangers. What does that mean?
Well, the park rangers represent the greatest threat to religious liberty in America today. Those who think that religious diversity is best dealt with by driving all religion underground, pretending we're all agnostics, basically. And now, if you think of it, in America, we don't deal with diversity by pretending we're all male. We don't deal with diversity by pretending we're all white. We don't deal with diversity by pretending we're all Irish. There's no reason to deal with diversity by pretending we're all agnostic either. But that is what they do. I call them the park rangers because of my favorite story in the book. Perry Mason might have called it the case of the sacred parking barrier. And of course, it could only have happened in San Francisco.
Right.
San Francisco's Golden Gate Park has a Japanese tea garden that is, as Japanese tea gardens always are, meticulously manicured and elegantly laid out. But in 1989, there was a problem. A parking barrier had been abandoned at the back of the tea garden, and it was messing up the architecture of the place. So park goers spent 4 years saying to the park rangers, there's a parking barrier in the tea garden, would you kindly remove it? And bureaucrats being bureaucrats, nothing happened. Until one day, a New Age group looked at it and said, you know, that's not just a parking barrier, that's a Shiva lingam. That's a manifestation of the Hindu god Shiva, and began to worship the parking barrier. Whereupon, the same park rangers who refused to haul it off as an eyesore sprang into action and said they had a constitutional duty to avoid violating the separation of church and state and hauled away the parking barrier. New Agers got a lawyer, it wasn't me, and sued for the return of their deity. Whereupon they gave them back the parking barrier, provided they worship it in private someplace else.
Not at the park.
Not at the park. Now, if ever there was a religion that was harmless in America, didn't threaten to coerce anybody to do anything, parking barrier worship had to be it. You wouldn't think that your kids were going to convert to parking barrier worship.
Yeah, I would hope not.
You wouldn't worry about taxes being raised to buy incense for the parking barrier. You wouldn't think that if you had your zoning application pending, you had to leave flowers in front of the parking barrier. It didn't threaten to coerce anybody to do anything. Nevertheless, it still had to go because they said it was religion, and religion doesn't belong in public life. And that's what makes a park ranger a park ranger.
Now, what makes a pilgrim a pilgrim?
Well, the Pilgrims are named after the good but slightly obtuse folk of Plymouth Colony, who in 1620 celebrated Thanksgiving, and then 6 weeks later banned Christmas. Because being Puritans, they thought Christmas was a papist invention, and since they wouldn't celebrate it, nobody else could either. So what makes a pilgrim is the idea that their religion, whether it's Islam or Hinduism, or in some places Christianity, is the only official religion that belongs in public. And the way we deal with religious diversity, in their view, is by establishing one religion and outlawing everything else.
One of the great things you do in the book is you destroy some of the myths we have about our founding fathers, about the Pilgrims, about the establishment of these rights that we take for granted or sometimes don't even think about today. You mentioned the Pilgrims coming here, and we have been taught, I suppose, since we were knee-high to ducks, that the Pilgrims came seeking religious freedom. You claim that is not the case.
The Pilgrims came looking for real estate, and that's about it. Most of them came from Holland, not from England. They'd fled England for Holland 10 years earlier and had all the tolerance they wanted in Holland, and then some. They weren't fleeing persecution in Holland, they were fleeing permissiveness. Their kids were being assimilated into a culture they didn't like. So they headed for the wilderness to get away from everybody and be pure all by themselves. They didn't want religious liberty for everybody, they just wanted real estate for them.
They wanted religious dominion, not religious freedom.
That's exactly right. The great irony was that, of course, other people kept showing up, and that posed the very problem there that we have today. What to do when you have to live together with people who disagree with you about what life means in the first place.
Why do you call the conflict between those you describe as park rangers and pilgrims, why do you describe this as trench warfare, in that these people are really fighting for their deeply held beliefs or non-beliefs?
Well, they've dug into positions that are immovable. One side says the answer to diversity is to celebrate one religion and only one religion in public and outlaw all the others. The other side says, no, we'll bury all the religions together, we'll be equal opportunity oppressors, and we'll paint over it with a coat of secularism and pretend that there's no such thing as religion in public life. And those two positions have no room to maneuver with one another. They're just lobbing rhetorical shells back and forth at one another. And the solution to the debate really, ultimately, is the Catholic solution. That religious liberty doesn't follow from believing the truth, and therefore only people who believe the truth have religious liberty. That's wrong. And religious liberty doesn't follow from being a gift of the government, so that only the government's idea of what religious freedom is on any given day is all the freedom there is. That's wrong too.
What is wrong with this ideal of tolerance? You see it in the Pilgrims documents. You see it in our contemporary dialogue and in some of our contemporary laws. The ideal that I will accept your religion, you will accept mine, will tolerate it rather, but I needn't accept it.
Tolerance sounds so good. The problem with it is tolerance really means I'll put up with you for some pragmatic reason. I'll put up with you because it doesn't cost me very much to put up with you. I'll put up with you because I'm a nice guy. I'll put up with you because maybe you'll put up with me someday. All those things are things that could change. And throughout history, when the basis of tolerance changed, tolerance evaporated. A right, a human right, is better than being tolerated. It's something that adheres in who we are. It says that because of the way we're made, because we're created in the image and likeness of God, we have a moral claim on our fellow human beings to be exempt from coercion, whether they like it or not, whether they think it's efficient or not, whether they think it's smart or not. We have that moral claim. We have a right. For example, Maryland was founded to tolerate Catholics. Within about a generation, it was hanging Catholics because tolerance evaporated when the political majority in the parliament changed. What's wrong with tolerance is what's always wrong with tolerance. The government changes its mind. Being tolerated is better than being persecuted, but it's no substitute for having human rights.
Let's talk about, and you point out in the book, and it's a wonderful snapshot from history, the conflict between Roger Williams and John Winthrop. Tell us that little tale and what Winthrop's folly is in dealing with Williams.
Winthrop runs the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, they're the next door neighbors to the Pilgrims. They're based in Boston. And they're founded to be a shining city on a hill. Their mission is different from the Pilgrims. They're not going to hide out and be pure all by themselves. They're going to be such a shining example to England. England repents in sackcloth and ashes and becomes Puritan, and they return in triumph. In order to be that kind of an example, there could be no unrepentant sinners and no uncorrected heresy in Massachusetts Bay. It was a ferocious place. Roger Williams was a brilliant gadfly. He was maddeningly fastidious in his faith. At one point, he separated from his own church that he founded the First Baptist Church in America, separated from it 6 weeks later because his own church wasn't pure enough for him, and prayed privately in his home with his wife until she went to England and prayed one day in an Anglican church and came back, and he found out about it, in which time he refused to say grace with his own wife. That's how fastidious he was. But he was on to something big. He thought that religious liberty followed from the fact that God had created us to love him freely. And in order to be able to love him freely, we had to be able to be free to reject him as well. So he took that message to the streets of Massachusetts Bay, and John Winthrop was not amused. Ultimately, he had him thrown out and banished, which of course backfired, because now Roger Williams founded his own settlement in Rhode Island and began sending missionaries back to Massachusetts Bay. And Winthrop's folly is the idea that you can suppress religious preaching in public and get away with it. And of course you can't, because religious preaching in public is a function of conscience, and conscience is far too stubborn. So you repress religious liberty in public, sooner or later it explodes in your face. That's the lesson that Winthrop should have learned, and he never did.
James Madison comes off exceedingly well in this book. Tell us about his contribution to our ideal and our rights, the Bill of Rights, and his contribution to religious liberty.
James Madison made the great pivot from tolerance to rights in May of 1776. This wasn't July of 1776. This was May of 1776. A few months earlier, he's writing in the Virginia House of Delegates, and he's in charge of drafting what would be the First Amendment in our Constitution, but the analog to the First Amendment in the Virginia Constitution. And he's got a draft submitted to him that says, we'll exercise the widest possible toleration. And he's fed up with toleration. He's seen toleration fail time and time again, so he crosses out toleration and says, free exercise of religion. The right to free exercise of religion. And that pivot from tolerance to rights based on who we are is James Madison's great contribution.
Tell me about Thomas Jefferson. He does not come off well in this book. What was his contribution to this whole debate about religious liberty? And tell us a little bit about the discrepancies between the public man and the private man.
Thomas Jefferson echoed in public James Madison's theory of religious freedom. In his bill for establishing religious freedom in Virginia, he said the reason we have religious freedom is because Almighty God hath created the mind free. And that's a great argument. Whether he actually believed that or not is an open question. There's much that Thomas Jefferson said in public that he didn't believe in private. For example, that all men are created equal. He said that in public, and then the day that he said it, he owned 200 slaves. 40 years later, when he died, he owned more than 200 slaves. In between, he freed precisely 5 while buying and selling another 30. And on the day he wrote in his famous notes in the state of Virginia that it was a good thing the legislature had banned the importation of slaves in Virginia, because that would foster the belief that slavery was immoral. On the day he wrote that and published it in Paris at his own expense, he went home to the services of his own slaves, whom he illegally imported into France. And it was the same on religion. He said that religious liberty followed from the fact that Almighty God had created the mind free, but in private he was a vicious opponent of Christianity, of Orthodox Judaism, and of the idea of organized religion in general.
And any minister was described as a priest.
Any minister was described as a priest, and a priest was somebody who was, by definition, the enemy of freedom.
Why did you feel moved to write this book? And I should say it's a very funny book too. It's not the normal dry legal recitation of cases. It has zest and brio and a lot of fun.
Well, I like to think that I don't take myself too seriously, even though I take religious liberty very seriously. And I wanted to make a book that was readable and fun and enjoyable, and in 150 pages made the case for religious liberty without being ponderous. I thought that it was just like as there was a gap out there in religious liberty practice between people who wanted to defend religious liberty from one tradition and people who wanted to oppress all religion generally. There was the same gap between people defending the idea of religious liberty as following from believing the truth, and therefore only some people had religious liberty, and the idea that religious liberty followed from the idea that religion was bad for you, and therefore everybody should be protected from it. Present again the Catholic argument for religious liberty, but do it in a engaging way.
Where does religious liberty fundamentally come from? Where does the right emanate from?
It comes from who we are and how we're made. It comes from the fact that we're made in the image and likeness of God, with hearts that yearn for the truth, hearts that yearn for the good, a conscience which drives us to seek the true and the good, and insists we embrace the true and the good that we believe we found, and then a social nature which says we express it respectfully, but at the top of our lungs publicly.
Why not keep it private? Why not? This is a personal belief, therefore I don't mind you practicing it, but not in front of me.
Religion is personal, but it's not private.
Why
Because
not?
everything that's personal to us, everything that's essential to our human person is something that we express in community. We don't smuggle babies home from the hospital. We have baptisms and brisses and showers. We don't come of age in secret. We have confirmations and bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs. We don't marry in secret. Lord knows we spend months planning how to spend fortunes to have weddings. And we don't bury our dead in landfills in the middle of the night. We weep together publicly. We don't live together, or we don't live alone, we live together. So we don't believe alone, we believe together.
Seamus, how do you reconcile absolute truth, and even Catholics believe there is an absolute truth, with living in a pluralistic society and a diverse one that we all occupy?
That is the big question. That is what the culture war is being fought over. The pilgrims say that their truth trumps other people's freedom. The park rangers think that freedom trumps people's truth. The church has got the right answer, and it's the answer that I give in The Right to Be Wrong, that it's the truth itself that guarantees human freedom, and human freedom is oriented towards seeking the truth. So it is the truth about who we are that guarantees us the right to search for the truth and the right to embrace the truth, as we believe we have, and the right to express the truth. It's the truth that gives us that. But our freedom isn't just freedom to do whatever we want. Freedom is freedom to seek the true and the good and embrace what we believe we found.
The paperback edition of The Right to Be Wrong, Ending the Culture War Over Religion in America, is available from the EWTN Religious Catalog, online, and at bookstores everywhere. Well, that's all the time we have. We hope you enjoyed the show. It continues on Facebook and Twitter. Go to RaymondArroyo.com. The Twitter and Facebook pages are linked on the left-hand side of the site. Like me on Facebook or follow me on Twitter at Raymond Arroyo. Let me know what you thought of tonight's interview. Until next week, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, I'm Raymond Arroyo. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye now.